The dog's name was Drummer. That was the first thing anyone needed to understand. Not the ship, not the war, not the 47 worlds the Kethvara had reduced to orbital debris in the 6 decades since first contact. Not the refugee stations spinning slow in the dark between stars, each one a city of displaced people who'd stopped counting their dead because the number had become too abstract to hold. Not any of that. The dog's name was Drummer, and he was a 12-year-old border collie mix with a gray muzzle and a torn ear that had never healed straight, and he slept every night curled against the left side of Commander Mara Adisicole's bunk aboard the salvage station Elmina. That was the first thing. The second thing was that the Kethvara warlord Sakethim didn't know what a dog was. He found out. Elmina Station occupied the gravitational dead zone between what used to be the third and fourth planets of the Kepler 442 system, a backwater salvage post that nobody in the galactic compact cared about except the 417 humans who called it home, and the Kethvara patrol fleet that swept through the system every 90 days to make sure humanity was staying small and staying quiet. The station itself was a patchwork structure. Hull plates welded from 6 different ship classes, corridors that changed width without warning, corridors that changed gravity gradient without warning, corridors that changed everything without warning because nobody had designed this place. It had grown the way things grow when people are desperate. Organically, stubbornly, without plan. Mara had been born on the station. So had her mother. Her grandmother had been one of the original 11 survivors who'd welded the first 2 sections together in the weeks after Earth went quiet. That was 62 years ago, and the station had been growing ever since. Not because life here was good, but because humans, whatever else you said about them, were constitutionally incapable of going extinct without an argument. She was 34 years old. She had her grandmother's name and her grandmother's jawline and her grandmother's habit of humming old songs when she worked, songs that came from somewhere further back than any of them could trace anymore, rhythms that had moved through blood and ocean and chain link and century before arriving in the back of her throat on a Tuesday afternoon while she rerouted power conduits in the lower bay. She didn't know all the words to most of them. The words had been lost in the same accident that had lost most of everything else. But the rhythms remained. Drummer found her in the lower bay that afternoon. He always found her. He came down the access ladder the way he'd been coming down it for 12 years, carefully, one paw at a time, tail low with concentration, the arthritic hitch in his rear left hip giving him a rocking motion that made him look like a small ship in bad weather. He navigated 3 coils of conduit and a half-disassembled drive coupling, and planted himself directly on her left foot, which was his way of announcing that he had arrived, and that she was now responsible for him. "You can't be down here," she told him, not looking up from the conduit splice. "Chief Akaffer will have you stuffed and mounted." Drummer put his chin on her knee. She scratched his ears. The Kethvara patrol ship arrived 4 days ahead of schedule. The Kethvara were not technically what humans would call a warmongering species. This was important context that changed nothing about the facts on the ground. They did not make war the way humans made war, with passion, with fury, with the specific irrational electricity of creatures who'd evolved to survive predators, and were now applying that survival programming to each other at interstellar scale. The Kethvara made war the way a bureaucrat processes paperwork, methodically, without malice, in accordance with established protocols. They had assessed humanity. The assessment had taken 11 months. At the end of 11 months, they had issued a determination. Humanity represented a Class 3 developmental hazard, not a current threat, a potential one. The logic was clean and unavoidable. Humanity was young, humanity was adaptive, humanity had already, in a single biological lifespan, gone from groundbound to spacefaring. Given time and resources, humanity would become a problem. The solution was elegant in its simplicity. Remove the resources, remove the time. The destruction of Earth had been a bureaucratic action. The warlords who administered these actions were not called warlords in the original Kethvara language. The closest translation was something like processing officers. Sa-Kethim was a processing officer. He had processed 41 civilizations in his career. He was thorough, efficient, and entirely without cruelty, in the way that a glacier is without cruelty. Not because it wished you well, but because your fate was simply irrelevant to its operation. He swept the system 18 days ahead of schedule because his instruments had detected anomalous energy readings from the Elmina dead zone. He did not expect to find anything interesting. He had not found anything interesting in 41 civilizations. Humans were not his 42nd interesting thing. He was wrong. The patrol ship docked at Elmina's main bay under the usual protocols: transponder codes, hailing frequencies, the mechanical formality of imperial contact that the station's 400 residents knew meant they would spend the next 6 hours walking small and speaking quiet and agreeing to everything. You didn't argue with a Kethvara patrol. You kept your eyes down and your hands visible, and you waited for the hull to stop echoing with the sound of their footsteps, and you went back to your life. Sa-Kethim came aboard with 12 soldiers and an administrative adjutant. He was, by Kethvara standards, physically unremarkable: 7 feet of carapace and calculated motion, 4 upper limbs folded in the Atti's position, sensory stalks tracking slowly through the corridor. He had made this exact walk on 46 stations in the last 16 years. It looked different every time and meant the same thing every time. You are still here, which means we still allow it, which means you have not yet cost us enough to make removal efficient. The humans on Elmina had a drill for this. Everyone to their assigned sections. Eyes forward, don't touch anything, don't make noise, under no circumstances bring the dog. Chief Engineer Akafar had, in fact, established this last rule in writing, with supporting justification, 3 years ago, after an incident during the previous patrol that he still did not like to discuss. Drummer was in Mara's quarters when the patrol began, locked behind a pressure door with a bowl of water and a chew toy and Mara's second-best jacket to sleep on. He would be fine. He had been fine before. The patrol reached the command center. Sa-Kethim walked the floor in his processing officer way, reading displays, issuing clipped requests to his adjutant, treating the entire station with the careful disinterest of someone appraising real estate they had no intention of purchasing. Mara stood at her post at the navigation console and kept her hands where she'd been trained to keep them and watched the floor. The thing that no one had planned for was the ventilation duct. The lower bay ventilation duct ran, as it had always run, directly from the engineering section to the command center air circulation system. It had been designed this way because the original builders had prioritized function over elegance, which was true of every design decision they'd ever made. The duct was wide enough for a dog to walk through, because everything on Elmina was designed for humans, and humans sometimes dropped things. Drummer had found the duct 3 years ago. Drummer had used the duct extensively. Drummer loved the command center. The first sound was nails on metal, the light rhythmic clicking of a 12-year-old border collie moving at a purposeful trot through a ventilation duct. The sound was brief. The second sound was the duct grill releasing from its mounts. It had never latched properly since the incident with Chief Akafar's lunch, and swinging open. The third sound was a small, gray-muzzled dog dropping 4 feet onto the command center floor, landing with a grunt, shaking himself, and immediately identifying the most important person in the room. Drummer's logic was simple and ancient. The being at the center was the one with authority, and authority figures gave food. He crossed to Sa-Kethim in 8 steps and sat down directly in front of him and looked up. The command center went very, very quiet. Sa-Kethim looked down at the animal at his feet. His sensory stalks extended to full assessment position. His adjutant made a sound that the translation systems rendered as protocols indicate, and Sakethim raised one upper limb and the adjutant stopped. He was, in that moment, genuinely curious. The Kethvara database contained entries on thousands of species. He had seen animals on dozens of worlds. He knew the general taxonomy of Earth's megafauna. He had not in his career encountered this specific configuration of animal plus human plus context. The small creature sat in front of him with a kind of uncomplicated expectation. Not fear, not aggression, not the behavioral indicators of a trained attack animal. It simply sat. It looked at him. Its tail moved slowly back and forth. What does this mean? He processed. What is it waiting for? He reached down with one limb, not a hostile gesture, purely investigative, and placed the flat of his manipulator appendage against the animal's head. Drummer sniffed it thoroughly and then licked it. Two of Sakethim's soldiers raised weapons. Mara crossed the command center in 4 steps, put herself between Drummer and the barrels, and did not think about whether it was the right thing to do. She picked Drummer up and held him against her chest and said, very quietly, "He's not a threat. He's old. He wanted to say hello." She did not look at the floor. That was a mistake in protocol. She knew it and she did it anyway. Sakethim studied her. "This creature," he said, through the translation matrix. "It belongs to you." "Yes." "It approached me without aggression indicators." "He doesn't have aggression indicators. He's friendly." "Friendly," Sakethim repeated, in the way that a being repeats a word they know the definition of but have not previously needed to apply. He looked at the dog in her arms. Drummer looked back with the particular serenity of a dog who had no idea anything was wrong and found the new large creature interesting. "What is its function?" Mara did not understand the question for a moment. Then she did. "He doesn't have a function," she said. "He's my dog." The patrol ended 2 hours later without incident. Sakethim issued the standard maintenance citation, 3 conduit violations, an improperly documented fuel cell, and left. The hull stopped echoing, the station breathed. Mara sat in the lower bay for a long time afterward, Drummer asleep across her boots, the drum of old songs in her chest that she couldn't entirely explain. What stayed with her was the Warlord's question. What is its function? She'd been asked versions of that question her whole life, in the language of resource allocation and compact compliance reports and population sustainability assessments. The Kethvara asked it in its purest form, stripped of any pretense that they were asking about anything other than what something was worth. The dog was 12 years old and arthritic and consumed calories, and contributed nothing measurable to the station's operational capacity. By any Kethvara calculus, Drummer was inefficiency. He was waste. She pressed her thumb into the worn fur between his ears and felt him sigh in his sleep. There were things the Kethvara could not calculate. She had always believed that. She had never had a specific example to point to until now, until this moment in this bay, feeling the weight of an old dog against her feet and understanding with sudden and complete clarity that this weight was exactly what they'd been trying to reclaim. What the 2014 expedition had gone back for. What her grandmother's rhythms were encoded with. What the word Sankofa actually meant. In the old language she'd had to look up because nobody spoke it anymore. Go back and fetch what you left behind. They had been leaving it behind for 60 years. It was still there. 3 months later, Sakethim returned. He didn't file a patrol report. He didn't bring soldiers. He came in a transit skiff, a small, unmarked vessel that wasn't in any Kethvara registry that Mara could find, which meant he didn't want anyone knowing he was here, and he requested a docking channel on the administrative frequency rather than the Imperial Command frequency, which was the closest thing to knocking that the Kethvara had. Mara opened the channel and said nothing for 4 seconds, which was the closest thing to what she was thinking that she could say without saying it. Then she opened the dock. He came alone. He moved through the corridors of Elmina without the architecture of authority, no soldiers, no adjutant, sensory stalks in the neutral position. He looked, Mara thought, like someone who had never in his life walked through a space without knowing exactly what he was doing in it, and who was now discovering what that felt like. She met him in the main corridor with Drummer beside her. Drummer sniffed the air and recognized the smell and went immediately to investigate, which meant he sat down directly in front of Sakethim and looked up with the full weight of his attention. Sakethim looked down at the dog. "I have been consulting the database," he said, through the translation matrix. "There are 17,000 species entries for Earth vertebrates. The domestic dog is entry 3,412. A pause. "I have read it 4 times. Mara kept her expression neutral. "Okay. It states that the domestic dog has been companion to humans for approximately 15,000 of your years. Another pause. That is longer than the Kethvara's current civilization. "I didn't know that. "I did not either." His sensory stalks moved. "I have questions that are not addressed by the database entry." "You could ask me." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "Why does it move its appendage, the posterior one, in that way?" "His tail." "The tail, yes, why does it do that?" "It means he's happy." Sakethim processed this. "It is expressing an internal state through a physical gesture." "Yes." "Without prompting, without function." "That's right." He looked at the dog for a long time. "The entry does not mention this," he said finally. "It mentions it in passing as a behavioral note. It does not convey what it looks like." Mara crouched down and scratched behind Drummer's ears and watched the tail move faster. "No," she agreed. "A lot of things about us don't convey in entries." He came back twice more over the following 2 months. Each time he came alone. Each time he sat in the common area, the largest space on Elmina, a converted cargo hold where the station's residents ate and argued, and occasionally, on the nights when the light was right and someone had found a workable string instrument, sang, and each time he asked questions. Not questions about military capacity or population data or the kind of questions that would appear in a compliance assessment. Questions about Drummer. Questions about the songs Mara hummed without realizing she was humming them. Questions about the photographs on the walls, printed on actual paper by Mara's grandmother and her grandmother's people, because they had understood in some wordless way that digital images were fragile and paper was not. Faces Mara didn't know the names of anymore. Faces that looked like her and didn't look like her. Faces that had crossed water and walked long roads and survived things that should not have been survived, and had arrived here, in this image, on this wall, looking back. "You do not know who they are," Sakethim said, studying one particular photograph. An older woman, broad-shouldered, hands that had worked for a long time, a specific quality of stillness in the way she looked into the camera. "No, the records were lost in the accident, when the colony ships went dark." "And yet you keep the images." "Yes." "Why?" Mara stood beside him and looked at the woman in the photograph and thought about the word Sankofa and the rhythm that lived in her chest. "Because they kept us," she said. "Whoever they were, they kept everything alive long enough for us to get here. The least we can do is keep their faces." Sakethim was quiet for a very long time. "The Kethvara do not keep faces," he said at last. "We keep data. Function, classification, contribution, termination date." "I know. It is efficient." "I know that too." He looked at the photograph. "She looks," he said slowly, "in the way of a being arriving at something he did not have language for yet, as if she knows something I do not." "She probably did," Mara said. "Most people do." The summons came on the 72nd day of the 4th month. It came from the Ara Central Compact on official channels, addressed to Commander Mara Adisakol of Elmina Station, marked with a priority designation that Mara had never seen before and had to look up in a database that was 40 years out of date. The designation meant, your presence is required, not requested, required. The common area went very quiet when she read it aloud. HFY, who had survived 60 years of Kethvara patrols by being smarter than he looked and quieter than he sounded, said, "They know about his visits. Probably. They'll want to know why a senior processing officer has been traveling to a Class D human station 6 times in 4 months. Almost certainly. He'll be in trouble." Mara folded the summons. "Then I'll tell the truth," she said. "He came to see my dog." HFY looked at her for a long time. "Mara." "He did, HFY, that's the truth." "The truth and what they'll believe are different things." She was quiet for a moment, her hand on the worn corner of the summons. Then she looked up at the photographs on the wall, the woman with her grandmother's hands, the faces whose names were lost, the children and elders and strangers who had kept themselves alive against every reason not to, and she felt the rhythm rise in her chest the way it always did, uninvited and unafraid. "I know," she said, "that's never stopped us before." The journey to the Ara Compact Central Seat took 11 days in Elmina's fastest shuttle, a converted cargo hauler that had been fast once, in the way that the station had been elegant once, in the way that all human things were more than they appeared if you knew where to look. Drummer came with her. This was not a regulation decision. It was not a tactical decision. It was simply that she had never gone anywhere important without him, and she was not about to start. She arrived at the central seat on a morning that had no morning, because the Kethvara did not organize their stations around the biological rhythms of a species they destroyed 6 decades prior. The central seat was immense and orderly, and lit in the cold spectrum that Kethvara optical sensors preferred, and utterly, completely silent in the way of a place that had never needed to be anything else. Her shuttle was directed to a berth in the outer ring. She was met by an administrative adjutant who informed her, without inflection, that the High Council would hear her statement regarding Processing Officer Saketham's unauthorized civilian contact, and that she would have, by human time measurement, approximately 20 minutes to make her case. She walked through corridors that were designed for 7-foot carapace and echoed under her footsteps. Drummer walked beside her. The adjutant did not look at the dog, which she suspected was the administrative equivalent of looking very hard at the dog. The council chamber was a hemisphere. The High Council occupied 7 elevated positions arranged in a semicircle. Below and before them, a floor of polished black material that reflected the ceiling lights like still water. In the center of this floor stood Saketham, in the at-rest position of a being under administrative review. He looked at her when she entered. He looked at the dog. Something changed in the set of his sensory stalks that she hadn't seen before and couldn't name. The council representative, the one who sat at the topmost position, whose designation translated roughly as the senior compact arbiter, addressed her without preamble. "Commander Adisacole, you are here because Processing Officer Saketham has made 6 unauthorized visits to your station in a period of 4 months. This represents a departure from his designated patrol schedule, an undisclosed use of a transit vessel, and repeated contact with a civilian human settlement without administrative authorization. These are significant protocol violations. Your testimony regarding the nature and purpose of these contacts has been requested. You may speak." Mara stood on the black floor in the cold light and felt the 11 days of travel and the weight of the summons and the memory of 60 years of keeping small settling into her spine, and she let it settle, and then she stood up straight. "He came to see my dog," she said. The council was silent. "That's the complete answer to your question about purpose and nature. Your processing officer arrived at my station, encountered my dog, and came back because he had questions about what a dog was, and what it meant that my dog was happy to see him, and why we keep photographs of people whose names we've lost. He didn't come back because of any security concern or tactical assessment or protocol deviation. He came back because something happened that wasn't in his database, and he wanted to understand it. The senior compact arbiter's sensory stalks moved in the Kethvara gesture that Mara had learned, in 11 days of research, indicated something like skepticism. You are describing a senior processing officer making unauthorized visits to a human settlement because he was curious. Yes, about a domesticated animal. About what the animal meant. There's a difference. She paused. She felt the rhythm in her chest. Your database has 17,000 entries for Earth vertebrates. It has demographic data on every human settlement in compact space. It can tell you our population density, our caloric consumption, our deviation from reproductive replacement rate. What it can't tell you is why we keep photographs of people we don't remember, or what it sounds like when an old dog figures out how to use a ventilation duct to find the person he loves, or why a 12-year-old animal with bad hips will cross a room full of things that should terrify him because he's decided you're worth saying hello to. She looked at Sakethim and then looked back at the council. That's what he came back for, not intelligence, not vulnerability assessment. He came back because he saw something that the database couldn't explain, and it turned out that there was a lot more where that came from, and he kept coming back because every time he did, he understood a little less and wanted to understand a little more. And I think that's called being curious. And I think your database doesn't have a good entry for that either. The chamber was silent for a long time. The senior compact arbiter said, "You are suggesting that the proper response to an encounter with an unknown behavioral phenomenon is continued exposure. I'm suggesting that it's a better response than what you've been doing for 60 years. More silence. You are requesting," the arbiter said carefully, "that this council reconsider the developmental hazard classification of the human species. I'm requesting that this council explain to me how a species that was worth destroying can produce something that your most experienced processing officer has visited 6 times in 4 months, because he couldn't stop thinking about it." They did not decide anything that day. This was, Mara would later understand, the Kethvara equivalent of a significant concession. In 41 civilizations, the High Council had never not decided on the day of hearing. The fact that they recessed, that they sent her back to her shuttle berth with a polite administrative notification that deliberation was ongoing, meant that something she'd said had done something unexpected to their calculus. Sakethim found her in the berth. He came alone, as he always came, and he stood in the entrance for a moment with the particular stillness of a being who has had a long day and is deciding whether to say the thing they're actually thinking. "What you said," he began. "I meant it." "I know," he paused. "The council it is not a simple thing. 62 years of classification data, 41 processed civilizations, the protocol." "I know about the protocol," she said, not unkindly. "I grew up under it." He was quiet. Then, the database entry on dogs. It describes the bond between human and animal as one of the longest-running interspecies relationships in biological history. 15,000 years. 15,000 years. He seemed to be weighing this. The Kethvara have been spacefaring for 12,000 years. We have never, in that time, formed a relationship with another species that was not administrative in nature. Mara looked at him for a long time. "How's that working out for you?" she said. He made a sound that the translation matrix rendered as silence, but which was, she was starting to realize, the Kethvara equivalent of something that had no direct translation, something that might, in the oldest human languages, have been called a reckoning. Drummer put his chin on Sakethim's foot. The warlord looked down. The tail was moving. He is expressing an internal state, Sakethim said. Yes. Without prompting. Without prompting. A long pause. What does it feel like, he asked, when he does that? Mara sat down on the shuttle deck, her back against the hull, and felt the answer come up from somewhere older than words. Like being found, she said. Like coming home to something that doesn't know how to be anything other than glad you're here. He stood very still for a moment. Then he folded himself down in the way of a being that has never sat on a floor before and is doing it anyway, because it seemed like the appropriate response to the situation. They sat there for a while, the commander and the warlord and the old dog between them, and outside the berth the central seat of the galactic compact moved through its cold, efficient orbit, and none of it touched them. The deliberation took 9 days. On the 9th day, Mara was called back to the council chamber. Sakethim stood where he had stood before. The council occupied their elevated positions. The floor reflected the lights like still water. The senior compact arbiter spoke for 47 minutes. Mara had the translation matrix running on a handheld device and read it as he spoke, and what it said, stripped of administrative language, was this. The Kethvara High Council had reviewed the developmental hazard classification of the human species and had determined that the original assessment had been incomplete. Specifically, it had failed to adequately account for the capacity of the human species to generate attachment behaviors in previously unresponsive subjects, a phenomenon for which no satisfactory risk assessment framework currently existed. Pending the development of an adequate framework, the active suppression protocol would be suspended. Human settlements in compact space would be reclassified from Class 3 developmental hazard to Class 1 observational priority. Contact protocols would be revised to allow for supervised. Mara stopped reading. She looked up at the council. She looked at Sakethim. She thought about her grandmother's photographs and the names that had been lost, and the rhythm that lived in her chest, and the word Sankofa, and what it meant to go back and fetch what you left behind. And she understood that what they'd left behind wasn't only names and faces, and the weight of a particular kind of music. It was this, whatever this was, the thing that made a 12-year-old dog with bad hips cross a room toward something that should have terrified him because something in his ancient wiring said, "That one, go to that one, he is worth knowing." 15,000 years of that instinct. 15,000 years of it encoded in the relationship between humans and dogs and woven into every interaction they'd ever had with anything, the photographs, the songs, the stubborn refusal to leave the faces of strangers on the walls of a salvage station. All of it the same thing, the same movement, the same reaching toward. They had taken everything from her people. They had not taken that. The formal reclassification was announced across compact space on what would have been, by Earth's old calendar, a Tuesday. Mara heard about it on Elmina's communication array, sitting in the lower bay with Drummer asleep across her boots, through a broadcast that was largely administrative in tone and deeply inadequate to the moment, but which was received on 47 human settlements and 14 refugee stations, with a particular quality of silence that was not absence but its opposite. The silence of people who have been holding their breath for 62 years suddenly, carefully, not holding it anymore. Akefir found her an hour later. He sat down across from her in the lower bay, which he never did. Akefir was not a sitting-down person. He was a moving-through person, and he sat there for a while not saying anything. "They say Sakethim requested reassignment," he said finally. "I heard. To the outer settlements, human space. I heard that too." As he paused, choosing the word carefully, as an observational officer, not an enforcement officer. Mara nodded. Akefir looked at the dog. "He's going to visit again, isn't he?" "I think so. With questions. He always has questions." Akefir was quiet for a moment. "What do we do with that?" Mara looked at the vent grill above the entrance to the lower bay, Drummer's vent grill, hanging slightly open on its faulty latch, the way it always hung, the way it would keep hanging because nobody on Elmina fixed things that didn't need to be fixed. She thought about her grandmother's photographs and the woman with the still, knowing look and the rhythm in her chest, and the word that meant go back, and the word that meant fetch, and the word that meant do not leave behind what you were. We do what we always do, she said. We keep the photographs, we keep the songs, we keep the dogs, we keep going back to what made us and we bring it forward. She scratched Drummer's ears. He sighed in his sleep. And when they come with questions, she said, we answer them because the questions mean they're curious. And curiosity is the first step towards something that isn't protocol. She paused. And that's how you change a civilization, not with weapons, not with arguments. With an old dog who wags his tail at the wrong moment. 3 weeks later, Sakethim arrived at Elmina. He came with no soldiers, no adjutant, no authorization code beyond the standard commercial docking frequency. He brought one piece of equipment, a portable data interface that he'd clearly spent considerable time configuring, because when he sat down in the common area and activated it, it displayed a query that read, in human lettering he had apparently taught himself between visits. I would like to learn more songs. Mara looked at the display for a moment. Then she looked at him. Then she looked at Drummer, who was already sitting on Sakethim's foot. She pulled a chair up to the table. She began to hum. It was a rhythm without words, the kind that lives in the body before it reaches the throat, the kind that came from somewhere older than memory and was carried in blood and ocean and century to arrive here. In this station, in this moment, in the chest of a woman sitting across from a creature that had helped destroy her world and was now, slowly, incompletely, with many questions, trying to understand it. Sakethim sat very still and listened. His sensory stalks were extended to full attention. On the data interface, he began to make notes. This is what the galactic histories will record, if anyone is left to write them. That the human developmental hazard reclassification was initiated by a border collie mix with a torn ear and a faulty ventilation grill, and that the administrative proceedings that followed were the longest in compact history, and that the translation record of Commander Mara Adisicole's testimony before the High Council ran to 14 pages and was quoted, in whole or in part, in every subsequent contact protocol revision for the next 200 years. This is what the galactic histories will not record, the sound of the dog's nails on the duct metal, the particular quality of the Warlord's stillness when he first felt the tail moving, the way a rhythm can survive 62 years of extinction attempts by living in the back of a throat and surfacing, uninvited, in a maintenance bay at 3 in the afternoon, the weight of an old dog asleep on your boots. The things that the database cannot convey. This is what her grandmother knew on the wall in the photograph, with her hands and her stillness and her look that said, I know something you do not. This is what the word meant in the language that was almost lost and never fully was. Go back and fetch what you left behind. Do not go into the future empty-handed. They had left behind 15,000 years of reaching toward something worth knowing. They went back and got it. The Kethvara, to their lasting credit and permanent confusion, were never quite the same again. Neither, for that matter, was the dog. He lived to be 17. He spent most of his last years sleeping on the foot of whoever in the common area was the most important, which changed weekly and which he was very accurate about. And he was in the common area when the first joint Human Kethvara Communications Council was established, and he was in the common area when the first Kethvara Cultural Exchange students arrived. 9 processing officers who had requested voluntary reassignment to human observational roles, and who stood in the entrance to the common area in their first hour on the station, with the careful stillness of beings, encountering something their database had failed to prepare them for. Drummer crossed the room in 11 steps. He sat down in front of them. He looked up. His tail moved. And in all 14 of the sensory stalks tracking him from above, in each one, in some measurable and recordable and utterly inexplicable way, something shifted. The sound of drums in the oldest recordings from Earth moves like that, like something remembered, like a rhythm that was always already inside you, waiting for the right moment to surface, like going back and finding, still there, exactly what you'd left, like the lingering spirit of something stubborn and patient and very old rising up, possessing, with particular and devastating gentleness, the stolen future of those who forgot to be afraid.